Why would a legal team fight this hard to make testimony public unless they were confident? It helps them. That question alone changes how you see everything in this case. Because in high-stakes litigation, nothing is accidental, and right now Baldoni's team is pushing for transparency while the other side is pushing for silence. And that contradiction matters because if this testimony truly supported Blake, there would be no reason to hide it, and once you understand why this fight is happening, the entire narrative starts to unravel. Stay with me, because what's coming next connects sealed testimony, leaked texts, and behind-the-scenes power moves that no one expected. From the very first moment this issue surfaced, there was a quiet but critical question sitting underneath all the noise. And that question is why a legal team would aggressively push to make testimony public, when every instinct in high-profile litigation usually leans toward limiting exposure because lawyers do not gamble with publicity unless they believe the public record works in their favor. And that single reality reframes everything that follows in this case. Because if Isabella Ferrer's testimony genuinely supported Blake Lively, then Baldoni's team would gain nothing by forcing it into the open. And yet they are doing the opposite, calmly, methodically, and without hesitation, which tells you this is not a defensive move but a calculated one rooted in confidence and experience. And this is where the illusion begins to crack, because what has been presented publicly as a plea for privacy suddenly starts to resemble a strategy to avoid scrutiny, especially when you look at how Ferrer was already pulled into this dispute not by Baldoni but by Blake herself, named, referenced, and positioned in filings as someone whose experience allegedly reinforced claims of discomfort on set. And once a party uses a person in that way, they cannot later argue that the same person's sworn testimony is irrelevant or too sensitive for public review. Courts do not operate on selective visibility. And that is precisely why Baldoni's attorneys zeroed in on consistency. Because consistency is everything in litigation, and when public statements, interviews, texts, and sworn testimony all point in the same direction, there is no fear of transparency. But when they diverge, transparency becomes a threat, and that is why this fight matters far beyond a single deposition, because it goes to the heart of whether the story told at the beginning can survive the record as it now exists. And as Baldoni's team explained, the content of Ferrer's testimony is neither explicit nor graphic, nor novel. It concerns rehearsals, comfort levels, communication with the intimacy coordinator, and reactions after filming a scene that has already been distributed worldwide. Meaning the argument that its release would suddenly invade privacy does not withstand basic legal logic, and when attorneys strip away emotion and focus on facts, judges tend to listen, and that is where the suspense builds, because Judge Lyman has already demonstrated a strong preference for openness, believing that public interest is best served when courts do not act as gatekeepers of narrative, but as custodians of record, and that judicial philosophy matters here, because if the seal is lifted, the audience will be able to compare what they were told before with what was said under oath. And people instinctively recognize when something does not align, and that recognition is powerful because it cannot be undone by statements or spin. And when you add the surrounding context, the pressure only increases. Because Ferrer had previously spoken positively about the set, praising the professionalism, the care, the communication, and the presence of an experienced intimacy coordinator. And she had sent messages expressing comfort and gratitude. And those words exist independently of this lawsuit, meaning they cannot be dismissed as litigation strategy. They are part of the timeline. And once those are placed alongside claims of fear or unease, the contrast becomes unavoidable. And that is likely why the focus shifted from substance to secrecy, because secrecy delays comparison. And comparison is what ultimately determines credibility. And then there is the procedural history, which further complicates attempts to frame this as harassment or intrusion. Because when Baldoni attempted to depose Ferrer through formal channels and encountered resistance, his team ultimately offered to remove her entirely from consideration, provided she would not be used as a witness by Blake either. And that offer is revealing, because it shows a willingness to narrow the dispute rather than escalate it. And yet Blake declined, insisting that Ferrer remain part of the case. And that decision locked in the consequences, because once a witness is deemed essential, their testimony becomes fair game for examination and public relevance. And courts are not sympathetic to attempts to reverse that choice after the fact, especially when the reason given is potential reputational harm, because litigation by its nature involves reputational risk, and no party is entitled to immunity from that simply because they are early in their career. And this is not cruelty, it is precedent. And the law operates on precedent, not sympathy. And that is why Baldoni's team continues to press forward without theatrics, because the legal footing is solid and they know it. And as this unfolds, it becomes increasingly clear that the real fear is not exposure but contradiction, because contradiction weakens narratives. And once narratives weaken, leverage disappears, and when leverage disappears, settlements change, strategies shift, and outcomes become unpredictable. And that is why so much energy has been spent trying to frame this battle as something it is not. Because at its core, this is not about protecting a young actor from harm. It is about controlling which version of events the public is allowed to see. And control is always most visible when it starts to slip. And that is what makes this moment so compelling. Because everything hinges on whether the court allows the record to speak plainly, and if it does, the conversation will move away from speculation and toward documentation. And once that happens, the story no longer belongs to commentators, publicists, or even the parties themselves. It belongs to the facts, and facts once released do not care who they disappoint. As this dispute moved forward, the focus quietly shifted from what was said publicly to what was said privately, and that shift is where the tension truly deepens. Because private communications rarely lie, and when they surface, they tend to expose motivations that carefully curated statements never reveal, and in this case, the newly unsealed and partially unsealed text messages between publicists, crisis managers, and insiders paint a picture of a narrative being actively shaped rather than passively reported, which matters because once narrative shaping enters the equation, credibility becomes fragile and the audience begins to reassess everything they have been told leading up to this point. Because when messages show coordinated efforts to seed stories into major outlets, to frame relationships as hostile, and to imply conflicts that were never publicly confirmed, it undermines the idea that public perception formed organically and instead suggests orchestration. And the more those messages are read, the harder it becomes to ignore the pattern of selective leaking, anonymous sourcing, and strategic silence, especially when those tactics appear to consistently disadvantage one party while insulating another. And this is where the story broadens beyond a single testimony into a systemic examination of how influence operates behind the scenes in entertainment and legal disputes. Because what we are seeing is not just a disagreement between co-stars, but an ecosystem of advisors whose incentives are not always aligned with truth or even with their own clients' long-term interests. And this becomes painfully clear when examining how Justin Baldoni himself reacted to certain revelations, expressing surprise, frustration, and even distress upon learning that articles had been placed or conversations had been had without his knowledge, which cuts against the idea that he was orchestrating a campaign. Because architects are not usually shocked by the blueprint, and this distinction matters because courts and the public alike tend to differentiate between active manipulation and being caught in the wake of others' decisions. And the more Baldoni appears reactive rather than directive, the more the narrative shifts away from him as an aggressor and toward him as someone navigating a storm he did not fully create. And this contrast is amplified when compared to the consistent thread of pressure and leverage attributed to Blake Lively, particularly in relation to studio decisions, editing authority, and promotional demands. Because while actors often wield influence at a certain level, the suggestion that an actor without contractual final cut could nonetheless force a studio to choose one version of a film over another raises serious questions about power dynamics and how that power was exercised. And when insiders confirm that one cut tested better, yet another was chosen for reasons unrelated to audience response, it invites scrutiny not just of artistic choice but of coercion. And that scrutiny becomes even sharper when paired with reports that promotional cooperation was conditioned on creative control. Because conditional participation is a form of leverage, and leverage, when applied unevenly, creates resentment, fractures teams, and fuels disputes that later manifest as moral or emotional grievances. And this is why the timeline matters so much, because when you trace events chronologically, a pattern emerges of escalating tension that predates any formal allegation and appears rooted in control rather than safety. And that distinction is critical because safety claims demand a different evidentiary threshold than creative disagreement, and when those lines blur, credibility suffers. And this brings us back to the role of witnesses like Isabella Ferrer. Because witnesses are not just storytellers, they are anchors. And when an anchor shifts, the entire structure moves. And if Ferrer's testimony under oath reflects neutrality or even positivity toward Baldoni, it does not just weaken Blake's claims, it actively contradicts them. And contradiction in a legal context is dangerous because it opens the door to impeachment, and once impeachment occurs, every other claim is viewed through a lens of skepticism. And this is why sealing becomes such a focal point, because sealing delays that moment of reckoning and preserves ambiguity, and ambiguity is useful when facts are unfavorable. And the more resistance there is to transparency, the more observers infer that something within the testimony disrupts the preferred storyline. And this inference is not speculative, it is rooted in human behavior. Because people protect what threatens them and ignore what does not, and the intensity of the effort to keep this material hidden suggests high perceived risk, and that risk likely stems from misalignment between earlier portrayals and sworn statement. And then there is the additional layer of expert commentary and external observation, which further complicates the picture. Because when psychiatrists, body language analysts, and industry insiders independently note signs of attraction, tension, or blurred boundaries, it reframes the dispute as one of emotional complexity rather than simple misconduct. And while such interpretations are not determinative in court, they influence public understanding. And juror psychology in courts are acutely aware of that influence, which is why they often favor letting the record speak rather than suppressing it. Because suppression invites speculation while openness allows evaluation. And Judge Lyman's apparent inclination toward transparency aligns with that principle, because the judiciary is not in the business of protecting reputations, it is in the business of adjudicating disputes based on evidence. And when evidence exists that undermines a central claim, the proper response is examination, not erasure. And this is where the suspense tightens, because every procedural ruling now carries narrative weight. Every unsealed document, every denied motion inches the audience closer to a version of events that may look very different from the one that dominated headlines at the beginning. And that slow reveal is far more powerful than any sudden revelation, because it allows viewers to connect dots themselves. And when people connect dots, they trust their conclusions more than anything they are told, and that trust, once formed, is almost impossible to reverse. And that is why this phase of the case feels so pivotal, because it is no longer about who speaks the loudest, but about who remains consistent. When the paper trail is laid bare, and consistency is the one thing that cannot be manufactured retroactively, and as more details surface, it becomes increasingly clear that this story is not collapsing under pressure, it is unfolding under scrutiny. And the difference between those two outcomes will ultimately determine how history remembers everyone involved. As the layers continue to peel back, the case stops feeling like a dispute about a single production and starts to resemble a broader study in how perception is engineered, protected, and when necessary, quietly abandoned. Because what becomes increasingly clear is that the emotional framing used early on relied heavily on implication rather than corroboration, and implication works best when details remain vague, timelines stay blurred, and witnesses are spoken for rather than allowed to speak themselves. And that is precisely why the battle over testimony matters so much. Because testimony removes ambiguity and replaces it with specificity. And specificity is unforgiving, especially when earlier narratives leaned on suggestion and tone rather than documented events. And this is where the role of public reaction becomes just as important as legal maneuvering, because audiences are not passive. They remember interviews. They remember praise that predates conflict. They remember moments that felt genuine at the time, and when those moments are later recast as troubling without new supporting evidence, people instinctively reassess. And that reassessment is happening now in real time, as viewers revisit clips, quotes, and messages that once seemed benign or even warm, and realize they do not align with later claims of distress. And this dissonance is not subtle, it is jarring. And when dissonance reaches a certain level, trust erodes, and trust once lost does not return easily, no matter how many statements are issued or how many articles repeat the same framing. And this erosion is accelerated by the emergence of behind-the-scenes communications that show how quickly narratives were adjusted once tensions escalated. Because when private texts reveal concern not about behavior but about optics, when discussions revolve around how something will look rather than what actually happened, the audience draws its own conclusions. And those conclusions are rarely charitable, and this matters because courts do not exist in a vacuum. Jurors are members of the public, judges are aware of public context, and while decisions are based on law, they are influenced by whether arguments feel grounded or constructed, and constructed arguments tend to unravel under sustained scrutiny, which is exactly what we are witnessing as more material becomes accessible, because each new disclosure does not exist in isolation. It interacts with everything that came before it, amplifying inconsistencies and raising new questions. And one of the most persistent questions now is why certain individuals distance themselves publicly without ever articulating a clear reason. Because distance without explanation invites speculation, and speculation fills gaps that silence creates. And in this case, that speculation has increasingly turned inward, questioning whether the distancing was driven by genuine concern or by alignment pressure. Once the narrative hardened, and when people sense alignment pressure, they become skeptical, because authenticity does not require coordination. And yet coordination appears everywhere in this story, from the timing of unfollows to the repetition of talking points across outlets. And that repetition is difficult to ignore because organic reactions vary while orchestrated ones converge. And convergence without independent confirmation feels artificial, and this brings us back again to the importance of sworn testimony, because testimony disrupts coordination. It forces individuals to speak for themselves under conditions that penalize fabrication and reward accuracy. And that is why attempts to shield testimony are often viewed with suspicion, especially when the individual in question has already spoken freely in other contexts, because courts ask a simple question: if someone can discuss their experience publicly when it supports one side, why can they not discuss it under oath when it may complicate that support? And there is rarely a satisfying answer to that question, which is why motions to seal face such an uphill battle, particularly when the material does not involve protected information. And the judge overseeing this matter appears acutely aware of the broader implications of secrecy, because secrecy not only affects the parties, it affects public confidence in the process, and confidence in the process is essential when high-profile figures are involved. And this is where the emotional undercurrent of the case shifts, because what once felt like righteous outrage now feels increasingly like strategic escalation, and audiences are sensitive to that shift because they can tell when emotion is being used to drive attention rather than reflect reality. And when that realization takes hold, engagement changes. People stop reacting and start analyzing. And analysis is dangerous for narratives built on momentum rather than substance. And this danger is magnified by the fact that the opposing side has largely allowed documents to speak, instead of escalating rhetoric, choosing restraint over rebuttal. And restraint often reads as confidence, especially when paired with transparency, because people tend to believe those who are willing to open records more than those who insist on closing them. And as this pattern continues, the story begins to invert, with early assumptions giving way to more cautious interpretations. And that inversion is not driven by loyalty to any individual, but by exposure to information. And information has a gravity of its own, pulling perceptions toward whatever is most internally consistent. And right now, consistency appears unevenly distributed. And that imbalance is what keeps viewers watching, because they sense a turning point approaching, a moment when enough pieces align that the broader picture becomes impossible to ignore. And once that moment arrives, it will not be marked by a single dramatic revelation, but by a quiet collective recognition that the story they thought they were watching was never the full one. And that recognition is powerful because it changes how everything before it is remembered and everything after it is interpreted. And that is why this phase of the case feels so charged, because it is not about winning an argument, it is about surviving the record. And only one version of events can do that over time. As the case approaches its most revealing phase, the remaining question is no longer what happened on a single day or during a single scene, but why certain choices were made after tensions became public, because actions taken after conflict often reveal more than the conflict itself. And in this situation, those actions point repeatedly toward narrative control rather than resolution, which is significant, because when parties are confident in their position, they tend to welcome examination rather than resist it. And the resistance we are seeing now is layered, strategic, and persistent, suggesting that what lies beneath the surface carries consequences beyond embarrassment, because reputations built over decades are not threatened by minor inconsistencies, they are threatened by patterns. And patterns are exactly what the public begins to see when documents, timelines, and testimony are viewed together rather than in isolation. And this holistic view changes everything, because it exposes how quickly a professional disagreement can be reframed as something far more serious once leverage shifts, and how emotional language can be deployed to override factual ambiguity. And that tactic, while effective in the short term, often collapses under long-term scrutiny, which is why transparency becomes such a pivotal theme here. Because transparency does not favor one side emotionally, it favors whichever side can withstand sustained examination. And as more filings are reviewed, it becomes clear that Baldoni's legal strategy has been remarkably consistent from the beginning, focused on records, communications, and process rather than character attacks. And that consistency is not accidental, it is strategic, because courts reward parties who stay anchored to verifiable material and avoid speculative claims. And this stands in contrast to the shifting emphasis seen elsewhere, where allegations evolved while supporting evidence remained largely unchanged, creating a widening gap that becomes harder to bridge as time passes. And this is where the role of expert commentary, external analysis, and independent observers takes on greater weight. Because when multiple voices with no direct stake in the outcome begin to notice the same discrepancies, it reinforces the perception that the issue is structural rather than interpretive. And this reinforcement matters Because audiences are more persuaded by convergence than repetition, and convergence is emerging, not through coordinated messaging but through parallel observation of the same underlying facts. And that convergence leads inevitably to reevaluation not just of individual claims, but of the entire arc of the story from its origin to its current posture. And once reevaluation begins, it rarely stops at the point intended by those who first shaped the narrative, because questions beget questions, and each unanswered question amplifies skepticism, and this skepticism is further fueled by the visible strain placed on alliances that once appeared solid. Because when people begin distancing themselves without explanation, it often signals internal disagreement rather than external pressure. And internal disagreement is far more damaging to credibility because it suggests a lack of shared belief in the narrative being presented. And that lack of shared belief cannot be concealed indefinitely, especially when legal proceedings require sworn alignment, and this brings the focus back yet again to the impending release of testimony, because testimony crystallizes positions and forces clarity, and clarity is what many appear keen to avoid at this stage. And avoidance is rarely read as strength, especially when the opposing side continues to invite disclosure, and judges are generally unsympathetic to arguments that rely on speculative harm rather than concrete risk, particularly when the information at issue has already been discussed publicly in other forms. And this judicial posture reinforces the sense that the momentum of the case is shifting away from spectacle and toward substance, and substance tends to favor those who have documented their actions carefully and refrained from retroactive justification. And this shift is subtle but unmistakable, because it manifests not in dramatic rulings, but in procedural consistency and incremental disclosures that together form a comprehensive record. And once that record is complete, it will not matter which side spoke more loudly or garnered more initial sympathy. What will matter is which version of events remained stable across interviews, messages, filings, and testimony. And stability is the ultimate measure of credibility, and as observers piece together the available information, they are increasingly able to trace cause and effect, recognizing how early creative disagreements escalated into public conflict, and how that escalation was managed through media rather than mediation. And this recognition reframes the entire dispute as one driven less by sudden revelation and more by cumulative pressure and misaligned incentives. And when that reframing takes hold, it alters how responsibility is assigned, because responsibility shifts from individual moments to sustained behavior patterns, and patterns are difficult to dispute once established. And this is why the coming weeks feel decisive, because each additional document either reinforces or undermines those patterns, and there is little room left for reinterpretation. And as transparency continues to expand the narrative space, contracts leaving fewer places for ambiguity to hide. And when ambiguity disappears, so too does the ability to maintain competing versions of reality. And at that point, the story resolves not with a dramatic twist, but with a quiet settling of facts into place, and those facts will shape not only the outcome of this case but the reputations and careers that extend beyond it, because in industries built on perception, the ultimate currency is trust. And trust is earned not through control but through consistency, and only one side appears to be betting on that principle. As the final chapter approaches, at the end of the day, this case isn't being decided by headlines or online reactions, it's being decided by records, timelines, and sworn testimony. And that's why transparency matters so much here. Because when the full picture comes into view, the truth doesn't need protection, it just needs to be seen. So as more documents are unsealed and more facts come to light, remember this: narratives can shift but the record does not. And once everything is public, the story will speak for itself.